Hi everybody and welcome to another episode of Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans, True Aussie Murders Caffeinated. I am your host Belinda Brady and welcome and thank you so much for joining me. I so appreciate it. Now this episode number 6, is titled The Brownout Strangler. And before I get into the reason he was called that, I need to list my sources, and there are quite a few for this one. So the first one is adb.anu.edu.au. Next is Murderpedia, followed by Trove, Trove. Next up is prov.vic.gov.au, then time.com, and then museumofperth.com.au, and finally ozatwar.com, and that is spelled ozatwar.com. Now, I will say straight off the bat here that this episode does talk about murder and might be upsetting for some, and if this isn't for you, that is okay. You can switch me off, you don't have to listen to me, and I promise you I will not take offense. If this doesn't offend you, if this podcast is right up your alley, then get yourself comfy, my friends, and lend me your ears, because I have an absolute doozy of a tale for you. And I know I've covered a few pretty gruesome, well, all the murders I've covered so far have been gruesome, but this one really has struck me. And I think it's because it's just so senseless. It just didn't need to happen. Yeah, so as I go into the story, hopefully you'll understand why this one really has stayed with me after I did the research into it. But lend me your ears, my friends, and settle in as we talk about the Brownout Strangler, also known as Edward Leonski. Now, straight up, for those who are not familiar with the term brownout, and I wasn't until I researched this crime, it was a term used during World War II in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, and that was their status during World War II, to keep lighting low to avoid detection by enemy's aircraft. So there was lighting, but only minimal. So, minimal street lights, minimal shop lights, home lights. So hence the term brownout. Not full blackout, but brownout. So another important part of this episode, what am I drinking? I am drinking a coffee. It is a freezing cold Saturday afternoon in my part of Australia where I am recording this. So coffee it is, a milky warm coffee. So hopefully whatever you guys have got, you're enjoying it and you're stocked up. And settle in, my friends, because I have a tale of murder for you. Okay, guys, so this episode of murder takes us back to Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. And yes, I am very aware that a few of my episodes have covered murders in Melbourne, but when I'm researching my next case and whatever grabs me, if it pops up in Melbourne, no, not my fault, guys. I'm sorry. And no, seriously, no hate or shade for Victorians here. I'm not saying that you guys are the capital of the murder state of the country, but you've had some doozies, guys. But anyway, no, seriously, no hate for any Victorians or Melburnians listening. So we are in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. The year is 1942, and like the rest of the world, we are in the grips of World War II. Now, as we are very aware, World War II was a truly horrific part of history, and it has been dubbed the biggest and deadliest war in history. Now, Australia wasn't immune to the horrors of war, as we sent our soldiers over to fight with our allies, resulting in enormous loss of life, but it also changed our landscape here back in Australia, with many foreign soldiers calling Australia home after being deployed here. So it wasn't unusual for the streets to be flooded with American soldiers mixing with the Australian locals. It wasn't an unusual thing. And in the early hours of May 3, 1942, the partially naked body of 40-year-old Ivy McLeod was found beaten and strangled to death. Now, she had been seen in the company of a US soldier the night before. Now, just 6 days later, another victim was found, And several nights after that, a third woman was found dead in a muddy trench near the US camp. Now, a link was very quickly made to a US soldier by the name of Edward Leonsky, and he was charged with murder and dealt with via military trial, but we will get to that later. Okay, but before we get to the end, before we get to how Edward ended up being caught and being put on trial, we need to get to the beginning. So if you need to, please put me on pause, top up your beverage, get comfy, settle in, because like I've said, this one is an absolute doozy. Now, and also before you do go, when you are done with me, I want you to Google a picture of our killer Edward Leonsky, because, or you can do it while you're listening to me, because he was a nice looking guy. Hey, seriously, he looked like he would not hurt a fly. But under that cheeky smile, one that would easily woo a woman from her safe space, lay a man who harbored a pure hatred of women. And this hatred went back to his mother. And it was so bad that a psychologist went as far as to label his murders as symbolic matricide. But like I've just said, if you need to put me on pause, do that. Grab yourself a drink, Google a picture of Edward, look at him while you're listening to me, and I will see you all in a few minutes when you come back to me. Okay, welcome back, guys. I trust your coffee or your drink or your little cheeky cocktail is in your hand. I trust you've looked at a picture of Edward. Keep him up there where you can see him, and let's get hooked right into this story. Let's get right into it. And as always, stories always have a beginning. They always have a beginning. So let's take a look at how Edward got to being charged with 3 counts of murder, and how his poor victims ended up crossing paths with him. So let's start right at the very beginning. So Edward Joseph Leonsky was born on the 12th of December 1917 in Kenville, New Jersey, to Russian-born parents John Leonsky, who was a labourer, and his wife Amelia. He was one of 6 children, and the family moved to New York during Edward's childhood. He left junior high in 1933 and took a secretarial course in which he excelled, and eventually landed several clerical jobs before being called up for military service on the 17th of Feb 1941. His family life was anything but a happy one, with reports of abuse and control and alcoholism. And when Edward eventually left for military service, he left behind a mentally unstable mother, 2 brothers in prison, and another in a psychiatric hospital. Now, Edward was stationed with the 52nd Signal Battalion at San Antonio, Texas, where he began to drink heavily, really heavily. And his preferred drink was whiskey laced with hot peppers, which I guess was an earlier version of Fireball, if, why not, if you want to say that. So it was around this time that he really started to display his hatred for women, with him trying to strangle one. Actually, he tried to strangle one. And funnily enough, though not really, sarcasm alert, he was not disciplined for this, and he was shipped out to Australia in January 1942. Edward arrived in Melbourne in February of 1942 and was quartered at Camp Pell, Royal Park, Victoria. But unfortunately for us Aussies and the locals living near him, he didn't leave his bad habits or growing hatred for women behind in the US. No, his behaviour was said to change rather dramatically when he was drinking, from doing handstands on the bar to talking differently in different voices, to even going as far as saying he was a werewolf. And a friend was quoted as saying, when he gets drunk, he talks like softly. It sounds like a girl to me. It is different to his usual talk, end quote. He quickly started drinking heavily and allegedly tried to rape a woman in her St Kilda home. So St Kilda is another suburb in Victoria. He was put in the stockade for 30 days for his drunkenness, but quickly went on another bender upon his release, and he wasn't monitored in any way. So just, let loose onto the streets, which would soon be proven catastrophic for three innocent women who he very quickly crossed paths with. Ivy Violet McLeod was born in 1902 to parents James and Kathleen Dargarvel. Now, I couldn't find a great deal of info on Ivy, but it appeared she had or she was married, so she had been or she was, and she worked as a cafe hostess, and her occupation at the time of her murder was described in the newspapers as that of a companion, though I couldn't find exactly what that meant. Now, on the morning of 3rd of May 1942, Harold Gibson was on his way to work where he saw a woman lying in the recess leading to the doorway of two small shops in Victoria Avenue, Albert Park, Victoria. At first, he thought the woman was just sleeping a boozy night off, but when she didn't respond to his touch, he lit a match. Now remember, it was brownout with minimal street lighting, so he lit a match and saw that she was dead. She had severe bruising on her head and lower portion of her body. All of her clothes had been torn off except the belt of her dress, and she was lying on her back, her legs folded under her body. Police initially thought it was a robbery gone wrong, but Ivy's purse was still on her body and it still had 33 pounds in it, so that ruled out robbery. A post-mortem revealed Ivy's cause of death to be a fractured skull. The newspapers immediately dubbed it a brownout crime, and it got a small mention in the press. So life went on. No one really thought they were onto anything, too horrific. This poor woman had died, but they didn't think it was anything too bad. But if police thought they had time to act, they didn't, because the killer struck again, and he struck quickly, a mere 6 days later. Pauline Thompson was born on the 19th of April in 1910 in Yarra City, Victoria, and she was married to a Victorian policeman. She had 2 children who were staying in Bendigo while she was based in Melbourne, where she was working as a typist for the International Harvest Company and at radio station 3AW of a night time as a switchboard operator. So she had 2 jobs. The afternoon before she died, she had met up with her husband and her son in the city and had been enjoying a girls' night out with friends on the night that she was murdered. On the night of the 9th of May 1942, Pauline was seen drinking in a hotel in Collins Street in the company of an American soldier. Pauline didn't seem drunk, and she didn't seem to be intimate or overly friendly or familiar with the soldier, and the pair drank together for around 2.5 hours. She was seen leaving the hotel just before midnight and was found murdered at the top of the stairs of her boarding house in Spring Street. Her clothing had been torn, just like Ivy before her, and her coat and hat were under her body. She was lying with her arms outstretched and her legs outstretched, and there were marks around her neck and on the side of her face. Her handbag was found in Flinders Lane, which was less than a quarter of a mile from where she was found. Examination showed that she had been strangled. Now, the police were certain these 2 murders were connected and they had a killer on their hands, and they needed to stop him before he struck again. Newspapers picked up on it and became front page news, and the city and the women within it were on high alert, with the press publicising what Pauline had been wearing the night she died in the hopes that it would jog the memories of some who had seen her. And it did result in the police interviewing at least 20 people trying to piece together her last movements, and the only thing they could determine was she was last seen with an American soldier. This was put to the public via the newspapers in the hopes it could help identify who this mysterious American soldier was, but alas, it wasn't enough, and sadly for one woman, this attention both Ivy's and Pauline's murders were attracting would not prevent her from the same fate. It would not unmask the killer, but before she unfortunately crossed paths with him. but her death would not be in vain, because her death would be the one that would bring him undone. Gladys Hosking was born in Perth, Western Australia in 1902 to William and Lillian Hosking. She moved to Melbourne in the late 1920s to work as a secretary for the Fintona College, and by the early 40s she worked as a secretary/librarian for the chemist department in Melbourne University. She was close to her family, and in one of her last letters she sent to her father, dated in April 1942, she told him there was a large parcel of land near where she was living and that it was being made into a military camp. She also wrote that she was nervous about going out late at night. On the 18th of May 1942, Gladys had finished work for the day and was walking to a tram with her friend Dorothy. Now, Dorothy and Gladys bid farewell to each other and they parted ways. And Dorothy would not see her friend alive again after that moment. Now, Gladys was last seen sharing an umbrella with an American soldier. And that very same night, an Australian soldier who was guarding some cars near Camp Pell reported a dishevelled American soldier covered in mud coming to him and asking him how to get back to camp. Now, the next morning, Gladys's partially naked body was found only 2 blocks from her home, inside a fence which surrounded Royal Park near Camp Pell. Like the other women, she had been strangled. And possibly one of the most heartbreaking things about this murder was that Gladys's father found out about the death of his beloved daughter not by a phone call from the police. No. He found out from reading a newspaper article about his daughter's murder on a tram ride home from work. Can you imagine? My God. Anyway, after the discovery of Gladys's body, several women came forward to police with stories of being attacked by an American soldier. This, combined with the Australian soldier's story of his encounter with a muddy American soldier the night of Gladys's murder, they quickly put it together, quickly pegged the area where they thought the killer would be and zoned in on Camp Pell. Now, from a lineup, a serviceman was picked out by several witnesses and a search of his tent revealed muddy clothing. Edward Leonsky was charged with 3 counts of murder, to which he quickly confessed, yes, hey, it was me, you've got the guy, I did it. On the 17th of July 1942, under intense media coverage, Edward Leonsky stood trial for the murders of Ivy, Gladys and Pauline, but as he was a serving US soldier, he was tried before a US military court-martial in Melbourne. Now, Edward didn't testify on his own behalf, but his defence did, of course, and they went with the can't control what he does when he's drunk angle, and also pointed out his family's mental health history. They painted him as a good man, one who, he was a soldier. He was a great man. He just lost the plot when he was drunk. Now, defence relied heavily on the theory that he was a schizophrenic or possibly insane, but this was quickly dismissed by a medical board who declared him very much sane and very, very aware of his actions. The prosecution, however, painted a grimmer picture of the soldier. They painted Edward as always in trouble, a show-off and a drunk, and a bad drunk at that, and one who drank more than the average soldier, so alcoholic. Shockingly, he apparently confessed to at least one of the murders to his friend, Private Anthony J. Gallo, with Gallo telling police, quote, I saw him standing in the front of his tent and he appeared to be drunk, so I stopped to talk to him. I said, what is the matter with you? He said he was going out. I said, why go out? Why not go to bed? You are drunk. Then he told me, I killed Gallo. I killed. Gallo also described in later conversation with Edward would often compare himself to a werewolf or Jekyll and Hyde. Edward stated how he had two personalities, and now his friend was worried and started to think maybe he did actually commit murder. Maybe he did kill somebody. But his friend wasn't the only one with statements from Edward to share with the trial. The investigating police did, and what Edward had said to him was absolutely chilling. Now, the following statements were given by Edward Leonski himself, and warning, some listeners might find these upsetting. On meeting his first victim, Ivan McLeod, who he killed on the 3rd of May, quote, I started to walk up the street and saw a girl in the doorway. She had a bag. She said something and smiled, and I said something about her bag. I walked over and felt it. It was very soft. She stepped back in the doorway and I followed her and grabbed her by the neck and I choked her. She fell and I fell on top of her. I started to rip her clothes. I ripped them and ripped them, but I couldn't rip her belt, so I left it and came back to it. Then I went mad and I thought, I've got to rip it. I ripped it and ripped it. On his second victim, Pauline Thompson, who he murdered on the 9th of May. I remember now about the girl who was killed in Spring Street. I met her in a restaurant. She was waiting for an order. I asked her if I could sit with her. She smiled and said, all right. I told her that I would rather have something stronger to drink. She told me that she knew of a place. We walked around a bit. It was raining and we stood indoors. We met a soldier who showed us a place to go and get a drink. We were sitting at a table. I bought a few drinks. There was a girl sitting at a table in the corner looking at me. I was looking at her. My girl wanted to shout. I told her when I went broke I would let her shout. She did shout. She was singing in my ear. She looked into my eyes and it sounded as if she was singing just for me. She was drinking gin squash. I tasted it, but it was too mild. She said that she was not married. We were talking about life. We got along swell together. She asked me if I needed any money and we sat around for a while and drank. She told me that she sang. After I went broke, she kept on buying all the drinks. When we left the hotel, she picked up her bag. She had a nice voice. She sang as we walked along. We turned a corner. There was nobody around. I didn't see anybody. I just heard her voice. Then we came to the stone steps. They were long steps. I grabbed her. I don't know why. I grabbed her around the neck. She stopped singing. On his final victim, Gladys Hosking, who he murdered on May the 18th after a night of drinking, 30 beers and 7 whiskies, apparently, is what he knocked back that night. Quote, it was raining and I asked if I could go home with her. She walked with me to a very dark part of Late House Street. She turned to go, but I didn't want her to go, so I grabbed her. I wanted her voice, so I grabbed her by the throat. She was very soft and didn't make a sound. I carried her up the hillside. I fell over a slope in the mud. She was making gurgling sounds, so I pulled her dress over her face and smothered her. End quote. Now, the fact that he didn't sexually assault or rob these women resulted in a relatively new term being used to describe his crimes, and it was relatively new in Australia at the time, but it was being used in the US, I believe. His crimes were thought to be born from a hatred and resentment of his mother, and the term symbolic matricide was used. Edward Leonski was found guilty of the murders of Ivy McLeod, Pauline Thompson, and Gladys Hosking, and was sentenced to death by American General Douglas MacArthur. Now, General Douglas MacArthur even went as far as to sign the order of execution himself, a task that was usually entrusted to his chief of staff. On the 9th of November 1942, Edward Leonski was hanged at Pentridge Prison in the same gallows that Ned Kelly was hanged, and his reported last meal was a simple meal of eggs, toast and coffee. Now, after he was hanged, Leonski was buried 3 times. In 1945, his remains were recovered and he was buried at USAF Cemetery in Ipswich, which is just west of Brisbane in Queensland. In 1947, it was decided that all Americans buried in Australia would be moved to USA. So Leonsky was dug up again and he was shipped over to the US, where he was stored in various places for around 15 months. He was buried in his final resting place on the 14th of April 1949 in the Schofield Barracks Post Cemetery. Now, I find it quite ironic that he has been moved around 3 times. He killed 3 women, you know. I think that's just a bit of beautiful just desserts for Edward there. So there we have it, guys. The good-looking young soldier with the killer's smile and friendly demeanour, with his raging alcoholism and ego, was harbouring a dark secret, which was a pure hatred for women. One in particular, the one who started it all, his mother, was the one he hated the most. And unfortunately for Ivy McLeod, Pauline Thompson and Gladys Hosking, these 3 beautiful women with their lives ahead of them and families and friends who loved them, had the ill fate of bumping into Edward and offering the drunk soldier some companionship and friendship, just as that hatred was ready to explode into a violent and murderous rage. It really, really was a case of the wrong place, wrong time for these poor women. And I hope their remaining family were able to find some peace and justice with Edward being hanged, and, you know, him also being moved around 3 times before he was finally put to rest. I don't know how you ever get past something like that, and this just struck me because it was just so senseless, and there were so many red flags with Edward. I mean, the guy had form. He tried to rape a woman, he tried to choke a woman, and I can't help but think, if the women who came forward after these murders, if they came forward beforehand, would he have maybe been taken off the streets? Would he have been jailed, or would he have been sent back to the US and dealt with there? We'll never know. And unfortunately for Ivy, Pauline and Gladys and their family, they found out in the most horrific, brutal way. So I do hope they were able to live lives that would have done their loved ones proud. And there we have it, guys. That is the story of the Brownout Strangler, Edward Leonsky. And I hope you have enjoyed this episode. I hope you have enjoyed this podcast. And thank you all for listening. You are all absolute rock stars, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. So until next time, guys, stay safe, stay cool, and stay caffeinated. I will catch you all later.